happy to help. All right, I'm going to go ahead and press record there, and just so I don't bother you or at all, I'm going to be right in this room out here. So if you need anything,
just knock on the wall?
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Is it like 1 time or 3 times? What's the usual
many
code?
times you want. Yeah,
All right, fair enough. Are we on? Well, welcome everyone, whoever's actually going to be listening to this, to the first What's Your Problem podcast with Bob Koncelik. I'm Bob Koncelik, and not that I say I've chosen, but I've randomly made an encounter with our first guest today, George Leef, and that's, by the way, L-E-E-F. And I guess it wouldn't be inappropriate to call you Dr. Leef, correct?
Oh, please don't. Please don't. My son's a doctor. I went to law school. You get a JD, but not doctor. Please, no.
But now hold on a second. You taught economics, is that?
Yeah, I taught economics.
Okay, well, so let's talk about that. You get a law degree and you end up teaching economics.
It's true, I did.
How did you make that transition, and what drove you to that?
All right. Well, I went to law school on a lark. It seemed like the thing to do in mid-'70s. Went to a school where the weather was good most of the year, and there was a golf course handy, namely Duke. And after 3 years of that, I decided, well, this is interesting, but I'd be a square peg in a bunch of round holes in the legal profession. So I decided to look elsewhere, and eventually I kind of stumbled into teaching. And there was a small college in Michigan that was in need of a new faculty member and someone who could teach a bunch of courses, economics, business law. And I convinced them that I could do a very good business law course, and I knew plenty of economics from my own reading. And they said, yeah, sure, go ahead. We'll give you a chance. And so I started teaching at Northwood University. It was then called Northwood Institute, for nearly 10 years, back in the 80s.
Wow, that's an interesting manifestation, because there are a lot of people who go to law school who use the law degree for other purposes, but generally it's, they're going to go into, be a partner at a private equity shop or some kind of a financial firm, or become in-house counsel somewhere, right? But that's a really interesting pathway.
Well, I decided that the world of ideas was just where I felt most at home, and teaching seemed to be the thing to do, and I was lucky enough to stumble into it.
Okay. Speaking of teaching.
All right.
You're the author of a book.
Yes.
And if we were actually recording this with video, our audience would be able to see. So, The Awakening of Jennifer Van Arsdale. When I met you, you spoke about this at the Bastiat meeting, and you were compelled to write this. And teaching is a significant undertone, theme of the book.
Yes.
Or misteaching, if you would prefer.
Yes.
So you obviously have made transitional choices in your life, like your career, right? Law, now I'm going to teach economics and business law. Okay, great. So I'm assuming that your drive to write this book came from a similar path or a similar calling?
Well, I'll tell you the drive to write the book.
Please.
It was the summer of 2020, and I was awash in anxiety over the upcoming fall elections.
Wait a minute, wasn't that the summer of love, according to that Seattle mayor?
Well, I don't. That
was
out
that
in
the year
Seattle,
before?
but it was the summer of anxiety for me. Anxiety over what would happen if the so-called progressives got complete control, White House, Congress, and could have their way with the country for the next 4 or 8 years. What would America be like? I think we're already drifting badly away from what made America work. And what if people like Biden and Schumer and Pelosi had their way for the next 8 years? What would America be like? And that was a pretty scary idea. And it was about then that I got the notion to try writing a novel about what would happen to America if we had 8 years of this left-wing rule. By the way, I don't call them liberals. I never use the word liberal that way. Liberal is a perfectly good word that means people in favor of liberty, of liberating people. Those people who are called liberals these days are actually authoritarians and statists, and what they want is control. So what would America look like if they had their way, implementing all the controls that they want for the next 8 years? And I was thinking about the many things that they had promised that they would do, like packing the Supreme Court, like getting rid of the filibuster, like having free college for everyone, like having universal basic income program for everybody. All these welfare programs that they've been talking about for a long time. They said, look, we're gonna have the power to do these things. And I thought, what's that going to do to the country's economy? What's that going to do to innovation? What's that going to do to people who don't like being under the thumb of authoritarians? And then I got this idea, maybe there would be a way of turning the tables. And that's when the novel started to take shape. And I started thinking, what if we had a character who was a true believer in all of this statist, authoritarian, left-wing stuff, and she had a change of mind? So once that started percolating, I began jotting down notes and then started writing pages, and then the whole thing turned into a manuscript in about 4 months.
4 months, wow. So you channeled your inner Ayn Rand.
Yes.
Or Ayn Rand, if some
Ayn
people
Rand.
prefer. And this is what you came up with.
It's what I came up with. It's kind of like Ayn Rand. It's kind of like Atlas Shrugged, except it's a lot shorter.
It's much shorter.
It's
much easier to read.
It's up to date.
Fair enough.
And I think it's maybe even a little more plausible than Atlas Shrugged.
Yes, I would say yes. Atlas Shrugged certainly has a little more, fantasy-esque,
Yes.
concepts in it, and pretty much everything in yours is, pretty worldly and tangible. So, this book, and by the way, like we've discussed before, this was probably the fastest book I've ever read.
Good.
Because usually I read stuff that's heavier, and this was actually very delightful, and I was able to get through it in probably 2 or 3 days, and it really drove home, and you organized it in such a way that was, I don't want to call it a step-by-step set of lessons, but it's obvious you've taught before.
Well, I worked in a lot of stuff that I used to tell my students, and I worked in a lot of other stuff that I've read from great American thinkers, like Thomas Sowell, for example. Some of the wisdom of Thomas Sowell gets put in the mouths of the ordinary characters you encounter in the novel.
Can you point out a specific instance of that?
Well, Thomas Sowell has never been big on this diversity obsession. He thinks it's just a terrible distraction. And I have one of my key characters say exactly that to Jennifer, that this is just a distraction to keep people angry, to stir up grievances. But in point of fact, no matter what your racial background, no matter what your ancestry is, you've got your own set of talents, and you should be free to use them to your maximum ability. And stop focusing on these ridiculous abstractions, like what percentage of black kids go to law school versus what percentage of Asian kids. People are obsessed with these silly numbers, and so I have one of my characters make that point to her, that it's just a silly obsession. It's a distraction from reality.
I could be wrong about this, but I don't necessarily even remember you using the term disparate impact in the entire book, but yet that's exactly what you talk about.
Yes, I didn't use that. That's kind of wonky, but I wanted to put the lessons in just everyday terminology, everyday conversation.
So everyday conversation, is doing work, working towards a goal, right? Bettering yourself, like you pointed out, using your talents and your abilities and not being lazy and being proactive and doing something. So it seems that your not the main character, but your
my villain.
Your villain,
Yeah.
or subject.
Yes.
Didn't do any of her work.
Right.
She becomes president and does none of the work.
Well, she's never done anything productive. Here's the character. Her name is Pat Farnsworth, Patricia Farnsworth.
Any relation to Leo Farnsworth?
I don't know.
He was the industrialist in
No,
that
no,
movie,
no.
the Heaven Can Wait.
No, Pat Farnsworth is just the only child of a very successful businessman in Connecticut. And she grows up having everything she wants, but she utterly rejects her dad's beliefs in the free market and liberty. In fact, she just disparages his beliefs. She goes to law school, hears a lot of way out radical theorizing amongst her law professors, as she had when she was going through high school and in college. She absorbed all kinds of left-wing beliefs. And she learned to reject the idea that you listen to other people. If other people disagree, well, that's because they're wrong. It's because they're immoral. It's because they're stupid. She never listens to other people. And that puts her in good stead in her quest in politics. She wants to go into politics. She gets elected to the House. None of her bills pass, so she decides that our system is rotten. We need more control. She eventually becomes Attorney General of California, and she postures to get herself elected governor. And as governor, she does all the same kind of things Gavin Newsom's been doing and other California Democrats.
Like a vice president?
Yes.
I think she played a lead role. She was very a part of the character.
Well, yes, there
here.
is some of Vice President Harris in Pat Farnsworth. There's also some Hillary Clinton. She's not a nice lady, but initially, my main character Jennifer admires her because Jennifer is a true believing progressive, and she thinks that Pat Farnsworth has done great things in transforming America from the backward free market capitalist greedy place that it used to be into a compassionate egalitarian society. And there's more to be done, but Pat Farnsworth really pushed America to be a much better country. And so she gets chosen, Jennifer is chosen to write the biography of Pat Farnsworth. And Jennifer is a writer, and she's thrilled at the chance to extol the virtues of Pat Farnsworth and leaps into this. She goes out to California and starts interviewing the former president in her palatial mansion. And things are going very well until something happens. I don't want to give too much of the plot away.
Okay, no, that's
but
fair.
Something happens that makes her start to doubt everything that she's believed, or at least some of the things she's believed up until that point in time.
Well, I think one of the themes that I got out of the book, is this declining set of standards.
Yes.
And a hollowing out of standards.
The hollowing out, and
we can even get a leader like this anywhere even remotely close to a leadership
Yes.
position.
Hollowing out is a good way to put it, because that's one thing that Jennifer notices where she's staying to interview the former president. She's staying at the Ritz-Carlton in Laguna Beach, which is a real place, and it's very nice. And Laguna Beach is a very nice town, except that in the book, after all these years of progressive policies, Laguna Beach is a rundown place. Stores have shut up. There are homeless people living in doorways. It's in decline, as much of California already is in decline. The inner part of California is really retrogressed in recent decades. And with more and more progressive policies, more and more left-wing taking, we find that people are leaving even Tony places like Laguna Beach, and it's starting to get run down, as Jennifer notices when she's in town.
Right. There's an erosion of trust in institutions.
Yes.
And in a lot of ways, it's due to this circumvention of the way that we used to govern, with some goal in mind that everybody, that these people seem to think is a good idea. Mm-hmm. But yet the results are an absolute disaster. So it's like, how do we even, start to get, back on track to, regain this trust? One thing that I did note in the book is I was kind of left hanging at the end a little bit, right?
Yes, that was deliberate.
Okay, well, because you're probably going to write another book, won't you?
Well, if this is successful enough, and if people ask me to write a sequel, I've thought it out.
Okay. Well, you could probably pick up the Leo Farnsworth. He's a distant cousin or something, and you'd play off that, because you have to go back and check out the theme of the movie. But it was very. The gentleman goes on to buy the Rams who were in Los Angeles at the time, so it could potentially be a nice connection. So, do you think there's any way, getting back to the standards a little bit, because if people aren't doing the work, standards erode.
Standards, especially in education.
I don't care. Well, listen, it could be construction, carpentry,
right.
Auto mechanics. It could be a variety of things. And listen, I don't think there's any secret. I mean, you go to a store. Do you get the same service that you did 5 or 10 years ago?
Oftentimes, no.
No, and that's really horrible, because how could somebody move up on a ladder or move up in a merit-based system if the standards are so low? Mm-hmm. And there's no way, and and this gets into some of the minimum wage law arguments and things, right? About businesses, it's a risk and rewards two-way street for all parties at all times, right?
Yeah.
And the folks like Pat Farnsworth try to eliminate these things with some nutty ideas about life being fair.
Well, they want life to be fair, and they want they want people to think that the government is their savior. That if you have a problem, the way to solve it is to lobby for the government to do something for you. If your wage isn't high enough, well, go and protest that the wage should be higher, that you should be paid more. Don't try to make yourself more valuable to your employer. Oh, no. The way you do it in America these days is you protest. You get politicians to enact what you want. If you want medical care, free medical care. That's the government will give it for you. You want more money? Minimum wages. Or a universal basic income to take care of everybody. That is really the cancer that's eating on America, that instead of looking to yourself and your own productivity, you look to the state, and look to the government to give you what you want. And we've had generations of politicians who have gotten elected and become very famous by playing that game of telling people, just look to the government and we'll take care of you. We're losing our independence. We're losing our freedom as a consequence.
And you know what? Who do we blame for that? We have to blame ourselves.
Well, yes, we have to blame ourselves.
I think we've assumed too many things over the years.
And it's Americans are indeed guilty of falling for the false promises of government prosperity. And we're about to pay a serious price for it unless we can pull back from the cliff.
Is it government prosperity, or is it more that we entrust in our institutions? And I think a great example of this, and you certainly touch on it in a few ways in the book, local schools.
Yes.
We have an affinity for our community, our neighborhood, our local school. We grew up there. We have friendships. We have family. We have community. And, that's, when you boil it down, that's what America was all about for a long time.
Yeah, yeah.
And we've built in a lot of assumptions about our institutions that they're always doing the right thing. And we stopped paying attention to content, quality, and standards.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up education, Bob, because that's a very important part of the book. Is what has happened to America is a consequence of the fact that the takers have managed to subvert the education system from top to bottom for their own purposes. Starting as early as kindergarten these days, youngsters are being fed statist propaganda. Ideas that they want kids to believe about, the environment, for instance, and gender and racism. Even starting as young as kindergarten, this is now being smuggled in. Grade school, instead of learning the 3 R's, there's much more emphasis these days on learning the progressive ideology. College, many college professors are not interested so much in teaching bodies of knowledge. What they want to do is teach progressive ideology. They want to turn out clones of themselves who will become left-wing social justice warrior activist types. In law school, you find it too. Heck, we've seen how bad it is at Yale Law School recently, where a large number of students decided they were going to shout down a speaker because they said, well, we heard that she's from a hate group and we're not going to let her speak. Here's an elite law school, and the majority of the students don't even believe in free speech. This is a consequence of the left-wing takeover of education. It's being used to propagate their concepts, their beliefs, rather than teaching knowledge that people can then use for their own purposes and being productive in the United States.
And it wasn't that scenario that you just described. Actually, the irony is that it was a panel discussion with more than one person about free speech.
Right. That's the irony of it. And they didn't want to. They knew that this one of these speakers had been accused of being affiliated with a hate group, and therefore they wouldn't let her even talk about freedom of speech.
Yeah. You actually wrote another article that was published in the Research Reports, the March volume of Research
by
Reports
American Institute of Economic
Research, and you talk about how law schools are becoming more and more dysfunctional and less valuable to us as society. Are there any points you make in here that you want to elaborate on, since we're on the subject of law schools and education?
Sure. Well, Pat Farnsworth went to Stanford Law School.
How'd she get in?
How did she get in?
Based on what you described, there was no way she was qualified.
Well, that's the decline of standards. And also her
Did they get rid of the LSAT for her? Or did someone else take it for
her? That's something that the professor that taught her constitutional law suspects might have been the case, that someone else took the LSAT for her, because she was really not a very good student. Law schools, they've turned to a large extent into training grounds for left-wing activists. Instead of teaching the nuts and bolts of our legal system, a lot of the curriculum these days is what an old law school professor I know, a friend of mine, calls bad sociology, not law. That's much of the curriculum these days. And that's because the people who run the law schools and most of the faculty, they're really ideologically driven people. They're much less interested in teaching the basics of contract law or tort or civil procedure than they are in making sure that the students graduate with the right set of values, which of course are these progressive values of equality, not liberty, but equality.
You know, as I'm listening to you talk about this, I always wonder. Competition is what made America.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of things that made America, but the general idea of competition in a free market is what made America and separated America from a lot of other places.
Right.
And listen, for better or for worse, the Brits taught us, right? You know, and for whatever reason, you know, anywhere the British were in the world has a chance today.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Anywhere France was is a disaster, but that's a separate topic for another time. But competition, when and how, and I get a sense that your book, and who knows, maybe your sequel hits on this, can competition save us again? And here's what I mean by this. If we're releasing certain people into the world that have this bent, this paradigm of what's right and what's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
there has to be someone else who wants to release a competing set of ideas, or a back to basics, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And only that will potentially save, because you'll be able to straight what works and what doesn't pretty clearly.
That's crucial. What works and what doesn't. We ought to know what doesn't work. Look at Venezuela, for example. They elected this dictator back in, I think it was 1998. They elected Chavez.
Right.
And he sounded so good. And the people thought, oh, our country is going to be so wonderful, be so much fairer once we adopt his socialistic principles. Well, 20 years later, the Venezuelans are starving and people are fleeing the country. That's what happens when you abandon the principles of liberty, freedom, competition, and try to make everything government dominated. Omnipotent government is the way Ludwig von Mises put it in the title of a book. That's what these people really want. They want omnipotent government under their control, and they don't see that the long-run consequences are a decline in prosperity, decline in innovation, innovative people leaving. That's starting to happen. It's happening in California, for example. Innovative people are flooding out of California, going to Texas and Tennessee and other states. The same thing will eventually happen in the United States unless we can turn things around and allow the takers, or stop allowing the takers to ruin this country and let the makers do what they naturally do: make, compete, produce, trade.
Okay, and you're revisiting an earlier theme about this competition for ideas, or this balance of makers and takers.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the makers that have been too busy making and defaulting institutional roles to takers.
Yeah.
How do we potentially reverse this? Like, for example, in your book, our lead character is a professional journalist.
Yes.
Professional. You know, should we start to have better standards, or reinstitute standards for our journalists?
Well, unfortunately, journalists these days are very poorly trained.
Right.
Journalism schools really don't teach them how to write good stories. Mostly what they do is they just validate their pre-existing left-wing notions and tell them that the thing to do is go out and write in a way that will help propel progressivism to even greater heights. Very few young people, although there are a few exceptions. I have to grant that. There are some exceptions, but mostly young journalists today are out there pursuing an ideological bent, slanting stories every way that they possibly can to make it seem like government's the solution to everything. If we could get back to standards of teaching journalism, that would help a great deal, because we're not learning the truth from journalism. Luckily, I think people are starting to tune out mainstream media these days, realizing that, they lie to us, they shade everything, let's stop listening to them.
To that point, and I'm really curious to hear your answer for this, because it touches on a few things that are antithetical. But do we have professionals? We have doctors, we have lawyers, we have accountants, we have financial advisors, and all those folks have to go through testing regimens.
Yeah.
They have to get licensed. They have to be registered. There's a process for them to do their work. I think we could make a very strong argument that the journalism profession, without such standards, has become dangerous, which is why licensing regimens in most cases were developed to begin with for public safety of some kind.
I'm going to have to disagree with you, Bob.
Well, that's why I said this is a delicate dance.
Yes.
And I am interested to know, would a licensing regimen be a potential solution to solve for this problem?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
No. Any licensing regimen is going to be taken over by the people who like the status quo. It would not improve things if we licensed journalists. In fact, doing that would probably make it more difficult, if not impossible, for some of the people who are doing real journalism these days to do it. Think like James O'Keefe at Project Veritas. Could he become a licensed journalist? I don't think so. They'd say, well, you're not doing it right. No, I don't. Licensing is not the solution. What we need is freedom. And I think we're only going to get back to freedom when people stop believing everything they're told, which I believe is starting to happen, and listen to voices who are speaking the truth to them, like Jennifer does at the end of the book.
Let's talk about truth, because one of the main themes that you hit on, actually not even a theme, it's probably interwoven within a few chapters, about how Pat Farnsworth admits to using outright lies to forward her agenda and destroy other people.
Yes. Yeah,
how do you get away?
Yes.
Now, and I was reading an article that talked about how the Chinese view truth. It's whatever suits them. Mm-hmm. And within any statement, there could be some percentage of actual truth. But who's going to take the time and go through the brain damage to prove one thing or another? So I wonder how you create a system that actually relies on truth and punishes falsehoods. Do we then potentially get to a situation, and this is a real constitutional crisis, where we have to create an amendment that's based on slander and libel and really, really, really defines what that means?
I think truth holds its own very well in debates, as long as there are debates. And that's what the left wing wants to eliminate. They want to eliminate debate. They want to make sure that people are imbued with one set of ideas, just like Orwell understood. Control language, control what people read and hear, and they'll become obedient citizens of the government, not questioning anything. 1984. That's what the Pelosi's and Schumer's and Biden's and Pat Farnsworth, that's what they really would like, to make sure that people have only one source of information. If they possibly could, they would like to have, as I create in the book, a hate speech commission, which would crack down on people who are engaging in anything they call hate speech, which of course means anything that they don't like.
Yeah, they hate it.
They hate it, and therefore it's hate speech. and if the United States is going to make a comeback, I think we have to pull away from the belief that everything you hear in the media is true. And again, I think this is starting to happen. And people using their brains, thinking, not just emoting as they've been taught to do, but actually thinking, weighing pros and cons. In the book, I have Pat Farnsworth, when she's in college, turn against the idea of debate, because she says she hears from a professor that, well, debating implies that there are two sides to questions. But in point of fact, deep in your heart, if you're really a true good person, you know what's true. So we really don't need debate. That just confuses people. Well, that's exactly what the progressives have done in America. They've told people, well, just follow the beliefs we've imparted in you, and you'll come up with the right answer. Don't bother listening to arguments on the other side. They'll just confuse you.
Well, so basically what that's done is it's created this massive blindness.
Yes, blindness. Yes.
and it isn't just a blind spot. This is like half your vision being gone. And it's horrible because and you know, to that a little shout out to my friend Doror Poleg, who wrote that piece a couple weeks ago. Now he wrote this on April Fool's Day, but I don't think it was an April Fool's joke.
Right.
Where he talks about this our brains default to following memes because association type memes, because it's just easy for us to take a package and accept it as truth.
Yeah, yeah.
And not dissect anything.
Right, yeah. More and more that is characterizing public discourse in America. Actually, it's no longer discourse. People have taken sides, especially the progressives. They are told, well, these ideas are the right ideas, and anyone who disagrees is either stupid or immoral. And so don't bother listening to them. It shuts off any real debate. It shuts people's brains down. It's groupthink. You know, we have a tribe and we have the right ideas, and those other people in those other tribes, they have wrong ideas. So we're not going to listen to them. Maybe, though, like happens with Jennifer, Americans will start listening to the other side and saying that, you know, these ideas that you've heard, for instance, that minimum wages are compassionate and only help people. Well, that turns out to be absolutely untrue.
No, they skew markets.
It's not consistent with reality. Or they hear that gun control laws will reduce crime. And so we have gun buyback programs and all kinds of government regulations designed to limit the ability of anyone to buy a firearm. But do they actually stop crime? Well, arguably they don't, and in fact they may make it worse.
Wait, hold on. I got to make a phone call. Mayor Lightfoot, listen, could you phone into our podcast right now and talk about the gun violence in South Chicago each weekend? Oh, you can't. Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, that's another one of these inculcated beliefs that the takers want everyone to have, so they'll think, oh, government is going to keep me safe because the government's going to do something about violence. Government's going to control guns. But it doesn't work, as Jennifer finds out.
Yeah, and you know, talk about perpetuating a lie. You know, that's actually a great topic about it, because when do you ever read about licensed gun owners killing anybody?
Or
how often do you really read about an NRA member going nuts and shooting a place up?
Right. You don't hear about that, nor, because it doesn't happen, nor do you hear about the many cases where guns are used defensively to prevent violence. That's never talked about by our journalists, but it happens a lot.
How often? Because wouldn't that be kind of a hard thing to not talk about?
Well, a few people talk about it, but they're relegated to, they're consigned by the mainstream media to, well, those are just crackpot people who gun freaks, and you shouldn't listen to them. They have nothing to say.
Maybe so, but okay, I'm a journalist in a local beat. There was a robbery in a store, an attempted robbery. One of the patrons shoots, you know, kind of like a scene from like that scene from Boogie Nights at the end where Don Cheadle ends up walking away with a bag full of money, and he starts his audiovisual store. The patron had a gun, and someone comes in behind him to rob the store, and everybody ends up getting shot because of a ricochet, except him, and he's standing there with the bag full of money, and he needed the money to start his video store, so it was kind of ironic. But a scenario like that would have to make local news. A couple of people got shot in a donut shop. How could you not talk about that?
What people don't talk about is the violence that doesn't happen, the violence that is prevented because someone happens to have a gun, and the miscreants, the would-be miscreants, flee the scene. They don't do any damage. So it's the dog that didn't bark. We don't hear about the dog that didn't bark unless you're Sherlock Holmes and think that might actually mean something.
So I guess that maybe part of that debate would start to get into, open carry versus concealed.
Yeah.
Because if we have open carry, it solves a lot of the big problem before it starts.
It does, and I'm in favor of that. Now, of course, the Pat Farnsworths and the Pelosi's and Schumer's and Biden's will say, oh, that's just going to lead to a terrible, terrible escalation of violence. Actually, no, I don't think it would at all. There'd be less violence. But that means less role for government, and that's always the foremost thing. How can we expand the power of government? That's what the takers want.
But, okay, we have so many bigger fish to fry. Right, and maybe in my humble opinion, I think getting back to fundamentals, which I think is also a major underlying theme of not only your book but a pushback towards some retreat to standards, and I think a lot of answers will be found in our federalism ideals.
Yes, federalism is a great concept. And under that concept, the federal government had very little power, very little to do. The federal government is supposed to have nothing to do with education, for instance, and yet it's massively intruded. Under the 10th Amendment, most of what the government does is reserved, in the language of the 10th Amendment, to the states or the people respectively. The federal government should have very little power. And if the federal government had very little power, then it'd be up to states to decide, well, what labor laws we want to have, if any, what gun laws we want to have, if any. And people could easily vote with their feet, like they're doing in California, leaving states that have bad policies. But when the federal government says, we're going to have this policy and it's going to be uniform nationwide, well, then what do? Leave the country? Most people don't want to do that. So if we could roll back the vast expansion of federal power and return it to the states and localities and the people where it belongs, that would be a huge step.
I was having this debate with a local known venture capitalist. I'll give a little nice shout out to my friend David Gardner, who I think is a real gentleman and a great representative of the state of North Carolina for the startup community. And he has a real, business rules and business codes and things of that nature, taxation. If it's so drastically different here and then you go across the border and it's so different there, it makes it extremely difficult to scale a business. Mm-hmm. And he's got a point. So, in a scenario like that, where, do you start to segregate business laws from what I'll call lifestyle governance issues, and leave more of the latter to the states and more of the former to the federal government, so at least we have a uniform way that we do things?
I think the federal government should stick to the very, very few things it's supposed to do under the Constitution.
Defense.
Defense.
Immigration, which I guess is part of defense,
I suppose we probably need a uniform federal rule on immigration. Education? No. It has nothing to do with it.
Issues between states, disputes between states they have to handle.
Well, the Supreme Court would handle disputes between states, yes. Should there be federal laws on abortion? No. It's not supposed to be a federal issue at all.
It's a distraction, actually.
It's a terrible distraction. The federal government really is supposed to do very little. Article 1, Section 8 lays out what Congress may tax and spend money for. And most of what it now spends tax money for is not authorized. There's nothing in the Constitution about Social Security, for instance. That should have been left up to individuals.
Agreed. It's the biggest Ponzi scheme ever created.
Yes. Medical care. There's no constitutional authority for government doing anything with respect to medical care, and it didn't do so until 1960s and Lyndon Johnson. America was fine and led the world in medical care until the government got involved. Previous to that, it was a matter for state control and mostly just private initiative.
So I'm really I'm really curious then how we can start to actually get back to some of these true fundamentals, the way our system was designed, because I'm having a real problem these days. There's so much noise, there's so much interference, but yet these rules or this format is hidden in plain sight. How can we have gotten so far afield from a document that everybody agrees is, it's the law of the land for the most part? How have we gotten so far afield?
The Supreme Court is responsible for that. The Supreme Court decided back in the 1930s, for the most part. It started even earlier, but in the 1930s was the real turning point. To read the Constitution as progressive politicians wanted it read, not as it was written. And that's why we have, for instance, the National Labor Relations Act, which gives unions all kinds of power. It should have been declared unconstitutional, and almost was, but for Roosevelt's threat to pack the court in 1936. The vast increase of federal power, spending power for welfare programs, all of that stuff was approved by the New Deal court. And they've been expanding government power ever since. Almost never does the Supreme Court say, no, you have no power to do that. That's unconstitutional. Now we have to start rolling back, start
closing departments,
downscaling what the federal department is, federal government's authority is. And that may happen sooner than anyone thinks, because the federal budget is about to go crazy.
What do you mean it's about to go crazy?
Well, no, really. It's
crazier, you mean?
It's about to become much, much worse, because interest on the debt is piling up at a geometric increase. It's not going to be long before there's so little money left for anything other than paying interest on the debt that we're going to have to do one or two things. Start downscaling the federal government, getting rid of things that it shouldn't be doing, like, say, the Department of Education. It educates nobody.
Just close it.
And Reagan wanted to close it. Too bad that it wasn't feasible at that point in time. We're going to have to start load shedding federal responsibilities. Or the only alternative will be print vast amounts of money to keep paying for this. And of course, then we get into hyperinflation. And inflation is heating up, but we ain't seen nothing yet. It isn't to the realm of Bolivia in the 1980s, where
Venezuela now, Zimbabwe,
or Germany in the 1920s.
Right.
To pay its huge bills, the federal government's going to have to do one or two things: cut down or hyperinflation.
I wonder if that and I'll call this a pocketbook issue, because I know that's overly simplistic, but I think most Americans can relate to that. And, the old, we sit around the kitchen table, you do your bills, you talk about money and planning and, running the household, those are things that were, that everybody really paid a lot of attention to, and it was always a concern.
Yeah.
And I think, to Bill Clinton's credit, it's the economy, stupid, right? And can we get our electorate back on taking that kitchen table pocketbook issue and applying it? And where I'm going with this is, and your book actually does a very nice job with an overarching theme about leaders and what a true leader is. In my mind, the true leader is, if you're going to elect somebody, they should be prioritizing what we spend money on and why we do it. And they should be putting significant political capital behind making those prioritizations.
Yes.
Why do we elect people who actually prioritize?
we have a few people like that, but we certainly don't have a president like that. We haven't had a president who really tried to prioritize spending and make the best use of limited resources and Reagan tried to do that. He was the last president who had, I think, any fiscal sobriety. And prior to Reagan, you have to go back to Calvin Coolidge to find a president who actually thought we had to have a balanced budget and did so. The idea that the federal government is a source of wealth and its spending is a way of stimulating the economy is just such a false idea, but it's become ingrained in many American minds, and we just have to disabuse people of the notion that federal spending is a source of wealth. It's not.
I want to get back to this because I have a feeling we're going to get into a debate on a gold standard. But I want to stick with leadership for a moment. According to your book, leaders are made. They're not born. But I think we actually need leaders that are born with some sense of duty and some sense of being able to go in and actually prioritize and do something that is effective for the folks you're leading. You know, like that servant as leader or leader as servant concept. How do we get there? You do a damn good job here. You do a
$64 question. How do we get there? How do we get a real leader who is actually concerned about the welfare of the country as opposed to the welfare of a particular party or a particular set of ideas? What we have right now is, yes, leaders who are concerned about how does this affect my party? Of course,
how does it affect me?
They talk about the national interest, but what they really mean is how does this help keep our party in power? Sadly, most Americans fall for that. They fall for the rhetoric of I'm interested in the public welfare. Maybe some skepticism is starting to seep into American brains, though, and they know that a lot of these leaders we have today and have had for quite a long time are in it for themselves. They're really not public servants at all.
They're professional politicians.
They're professional politicians. They're serving themselves. If someone can come along and convince them that I am the guy or gal who is going to actually prioritize things for your benefit, not for the benefit of my party and not for the benefit of the apparatchiks in the government, but to make your life better, or to make it so you can make your life better is actually the way to put it, so that you will be in charge of your own life again. I think that candidate has a chance these days.
Yeah, I'm going to leave you alone. You know, I always found it ironic. I mean, Trump was a unique guy. He's not pulling any punches about that. Mm-hmm. He's in his own. He's like Johnny Cash is to music in a way. And I know a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, they're going to think this is sacrilegious," but that's not where I'm going. How do we, America first, and then you see people running around, progressives, left-wing folks, resist. That's what they run around with as a button on their car bumper stickers. Right. What are you resisting? Having more rights? Having more freedoms? You're resisting that?
Yes.
I don't understand the logic behind that.
I think
the stupid circular logic.
What I think it means is resist the president, namely Donald Trump, who was not a full-blown progressive, who didn't want to expand the government in every direction like they want to. So they had to resist that as if it was, to use a medical analogy, like a foreign invading thing getting into your body, and the body says, "Oh, we have to resist this. We have to fight this off. It's harmful to us." Well, that's what they saw as any politician, and they would have, I'm sure, done the same thing if some other person other than Trump had been elected in 2016. If it had been, let's say, Rand Paul. they'd have done the same thing to Rand Paul, resist, because they can't stand the idea of government shrinking. Remember it was Gorbachev, or no, not Brezhnev, earlier, Soviet leaders. So the Brezhnev doctrine is we can never retreat from socialism. Any country that's ever taken over by socialism can never go back. Well, that's the way the progressives look at American politics. We can never go back. We can never go back toward free enterprise. We can never go back toward voluntary education. We can never go back. We can only move toward more government control that we favor. So that's why they resist.
Okay. All right. Thanks for explaining that to me, because I was never able to really square that. And you know what? I wasn't going to ask anybody who was wearing the pin or had that on their car as to why they feel that way.
Well, I think I've answered your question.
No. You did a very good job, but I guarantee you the answer from them would have been very different. Why are you asking me? So who do you think is a leader that can actually lead and get us to a point where, we can start to close some of these governmental agencies and actually get our elected representatives to be doing the jobs that they're supposed to be doing, like writing legislation, and not being pundits who were elected pundits?
Yeah.
It's this, in my mind, this is part and parcel of that leaders, made versus born kind of thing.
Well, we need them. I don't know how we get them. I really don't. The current political two-party system has not done a very good job of letting individuals who really want to work for the public good, which means downsizing the government, restoring federalism, restoring the Constitution's proper limits. Those people don't seem to get any place for the most part. Perhaps that's going to change. But in certainly not in the Democratic Party, and not too many Republicans do you find anyone with the fire in the belly for doing what Margaret Thatcher did and taking the bully pulpit and telling people the truth that we can't afford government. Government is the problem, not the solution, and we have to start cutting it down.
So we need our own Iron Lady.
I think that is crucial. The Iron Lady was very good at making the case for her philosophy. Reagan was kind of good at it, could have been better, but he tried. We haven't had anyone since who even tried to make the case for limited government and why people would be better off if the government left them alone instead of meddling in their affairs and taxing them and regulating them constantly.
I wonder what the real place to start is. And I wonder, you could look to other examples, like parliamentary type governments. And, you read about, elections every other week, trying to come up with a governing coalition.
Yeah.
And how does that work out? Not well, doesn't seem.
I don't think the key thing is the structure of the government. The key thing is the philosophy of the people. America worked very well from the founding of the nation, 1776, until roughly the 1930s.
Oh, I thought it was 1619.
No, it's not 1619. No. Because the people, for the most part, held to a live and let live, golden rule kind of philosophy where you could succeed on your own merits. And if you didn't succeed, well, you suffered the consequences, and maybe people would help you out, but no one was looking to the government to do things for them. That's why people flooded into America from Europe and Asia and all corners of the world, because they knew that here you had equal opportunity for everyone to succeed. We need to get back to that. And if we have that spirit of liberty, that I can make it on my own, I'm not looking to the government to help me, I'm not looking to the government to rip off my competitors or hobble my competitors. If we get back to the spirit of liberty that animated America, then it won't really matter what kind of system of government we have. And per contra, if people believe in all these progressive ideas that it's the government's duty to make you feel good and provide for you, then it won't matter either what kind of government we have, because we'll get the government that the people deserve, which is to say, it's going to be an oppressive one that's going to ruin their futures.
And I guess we can both agree that people are waking up to that reality now.
I think COVID has done a lot to wake people up to the reality that government is not their friend. Government is not scientific. Government is not in the public interest. Government is people with power doing what keeps them in power. Government is keep people in power, not following the science, but following their instincts, which is a control, and lying to people to maintain that control, suppressing information to make themselves look good. Americans are getting the sense that that's really what government is about, rather than the unicorns and rainbows view that the progressives have of government.
So that brings to mind, I was flipping through channels last night, and of course, A Few Good Men is on. You can't handle the truth.
Yeah, yes.
Can we handle the truth, George?
Yeah, I think a lot of Americans can handle the truth. All they have to do is hear it. At the end of my book, a lot of Americans could handle the truth when they heard it from Jennifer Van Arsdale. They liked what they heard.
In the B book. Or I should say the alternate.
Well, yes. Let's not give too much away, but there are two stories that Jennifer is behind, two books she's behind. And one of them is the biography that Pat Farnsworth wanted, and the other is the alternative to it. And people like the alternative.
Interesting. Now, one thing actually that I'll point out, and since you have some understanding of the law, she stuck to her contract. Contracts were not ignored. She honored the contract.
Well,
and wrote the book that she was hired to write.
Well, that's true. She did honor the contract, and the contract didn't say, it's kind of like The Merchant of Venice. The contract didn't say that she couldn't write a second book, which is what happens. It sets off all kinds of consternation.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to the sequel, where I'm sure that that's probably what you'll pick up.
I hope
guess. So. Well, it's logical. It's logical, and I wonder if and this is just an idea. If the "I'm with her" actually continues, but it takes on a whole new meaning in the next book.
Yes, it could. The "her" might be a different.
I'm thinking the "her" is Jennifer.
Woman. It could be. Could be.
Jennifer is the new her.
Jennifer probably will have more exploits in the future. She's a good character.
I would say so. And in this case, I'd say that Jennifer was born and made as a leader.
Well,
she discovered. I think she discovered her leadership legs.
Yes, she did. Yes, I would agree.
One thing that we need, getting back to, like the concept of doing the work and taking shortcuts, if you train, physically all the time and you get physical exercise, you don't just do it one day.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's a constant building and improvement of a set of skills. Speed, agility, strength, flexibility, right? I mean, it's a variety of things. Or, like I practice Aikido, you study martial arts. You don't even think about getting a black belt in an art like that unless you're committing 10, 15 years.
Yes,
of your life to it.
Yes, yes.
And it's it's something that's learned very gradually, in a lot of ways very naturally. And but you get some excellent guidance and wisdom from people who have been practicing much longer in many more places,
right.
And with so that experience level shows through. Do we have, and I'm going to use this term very, very loosely here, do we have more senseis or more personal trainers out there who can actually get us a new crop of leaders that are going to help people realize we have a long road to hoe?
Oh, I think so. And a lot of them are no longer with us. But there are a lot of people who wrote brilliantly in the past about the issues that I bring up in the book, about what happens when you lose your freedom, when you adopt omnipotent government. Lots of brilliant people have written about that in the past. We can look to them. And we have a lot of very good spokesmen today. Unfortunately, most of them aren't in politics, but some good spokesmen out of politics who can explain why we need to get back to the fundamentals of individual freedom, limited government. When people hear those explanations, I think a lot of them are going to start to say, yeah, that makes sense to me. And they're going to start to turn their back on government, which is increasingly ruining their lives, ruining their education, ruining their businesses.
Ruining their money.
Ruining their money, inflation. I think people are going to be more willing to listen to the ideas of Adam Smith, for instance, and Frederick Bastiat, and Hayek, and von Mises, and Thomas Sowell, because they're going to start to resonate. People are going to say, yeah, reality, that's the thing. These government ideas about government control, they're at odds with reality, and they're ruining our lives.
Okay, so then do any of these people, not the folks who have passed, but any of the current people who channel or champion their ideas or their ideals, who are they, and can they run? Can they get in? Can they get elected?
Oh, they probably don't want to get elected.
Well, okay, here's where but makers and
not
takers.
Politicians.
But the makers are too busy making, and they defaulted to others.
Yeah.
Look at where that's gotten us.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer for that. How do we find the Margaret Thatchers, or even improve upon Margaret Thatcher, who was, after all, pretty abrasive? We need somebody who is better at selling the ideas of liberty in a way that will appeal to your typical American of 2022. Margaret Thatcher's style probably wouldn't work very well. We need to find the people who can sell it. I think they're out there. I think there are young people who could figure out, how do you get young people off of the idea that government is your savior, government will take care of you, government must do everything, and get them believing government's the problem, get it out of the way, and we'll have a much more prosperous and harmonious country.
Do you think that argument rests upon reintroducing religious ideals, moralistic ideals, not as a state-mandated, idea, but just allowing for some of those conversations to seep back in about? There's a lot of great lessons to be learned, and the philosophical lessons and lifestyle lessons, and there's a lot of guidance, spiritual guidance.
Unfortunately, many organized churches these days have sided with the takers. They're now part of the problem, part of the progressive philosophy. They support it. Perhaps, though, people are going to start to see that there is something basically immoral about what the takers have done. There's something basically immoral when, for instance, you tell parents, we're going to shut down these schools so your kids cannot go to school because we think they might catch COVID. There was never much chance of that. But parents are now understand that yeah, that was harmful. They shouldn't have that power over me. It's what they've done is immoral to force us to live the way the dictators in Washington want us to live, the Faucis, the Pelosi's, the Schumers, all those people. Whether it comes from a religious conviction or not, people can see that there's an immorality in the domineering nature of the takers, the so-called progressives. And people may say, "Yeah, I'm put off by that. That's wrong. I'm gonna resist that," because that's what we really need: the resistance to the overweening power of government.
That brings up an interesting thought in my mind about, as a New Yorker. You remember that cartoon on the cover of the New Yorker, the famous one where it shows Manhattan, it's
Yes.
East Side, Central Park, West Side,
yes.
Hudson River, New Jersey, and then it kind of just fades out.
Yes, and the rest of the country is almost nothing.
It doesn't matter. The flyover country.
Yeah.
And I think that mental outlook, if you would, or paradigm if you prefer, is part and parcel of exactly that. It's like, who do you trust to come up with the solution? Do you trust someone from flyover country, or do you trust a coastal elite? Because they've been making the case that they're the ones who have it all figured out.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly what they've been saying for generations, that you have to.
Pat Farnsworth was the poster child for this.
You have to trust the elites in society to do the right thing. And these old-fashioned notions about individual liberty and capitalism, well, that's old-fashioned. We need scientific management. This goes back to the so-called progressives of the early part of the 20th century. They said, American freedom, that was so old-fashioned, so outmoded. We need scientific control. Woodrow Wilson believed in that. Did a lot of damage to this country. But that idea has been propounded to generations of Americans that, trust the elites. Trust them and they'll do the right thing. And what I'm saying is no. The elites make mistakes, and they never own up to their mistakes, never change their mistakes. What we need is freedom. Let people compete. Some people will make mistakes, but they'll correct their mistakes very quickly when they realize they are mistakes.
Or they'll be out of business.
They'll be out of business.
Whatever that looks like.
Yes. We won't have anyone like Fauci dictating to us what we must do in order to avoid getting COVID.
Okay, you're touching on a great theme now. Now I'm energized. There's this belief that we can control everything. Outcomes, equal outcomes.
Yeah.
Horseshit, right? The great financial crisis. We're still paying for it. Could have been over a long time ago if you would have let actual bankruptcy code work the way it was designed.
Yes.
As opposed to bailing out people who made bad bets and propelled this, and got stuck in a credit crisis. You know what? You chose the people you're doing business with. You got to sink and swim on that.
Yep.
When I was in my own business, I had a moving company. You did a bad job. Guess what? The bill didn't get paid. Guess what? You did, or it didn't get paid in full. Or guess what? You had insurance claims to deal with, or whatever it was. There was always, or your competitors heard about it in about 10 seconds, and would negative sell you for the next 3 months.
Yep.
On every project you bid on, from one error.
Yeah, that's the great thing about competition is you have to suffer the consequences of bad decisions. And that's the big problem with government, is the people in government don't suffer the consequences of their bad decisions. If politicians want to make the minimum wage $20 an hour, they don't suffer the consequences of young people being unable to get any honest work. That's not going to be their problem. They live in cloistered communities and they're safe. They don't have to worry about the consequences of their actions. And that's why we have to have as little government as possible. What Jefferson said was right. That government that governs best governs least. And what he meant was just leave people alone. We have to have We have to enforce the laws. We have to protect people's life, liberty, and property. But other than that, leave them alone, and we'll have a much better society than if the government controls things.
Meddling in it's funny. All these folks want to meddle in, like we can control climate.
Yes.
Are you serious? How is this even like a serious issue? It's like, yeah, there are some things you could do naturally over time as, markets adjust and new technologies are invented and things that'll change over time. But to try and control that and control our money and control our business flows, and prop up zombie companies.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We are to the point. Why do we not? Nature has a way of dealing with things. There's a natural progression of what species win, which ones don't, which ones alter, which ones don't. Right? There's always a clearing. Why don't we get back to allowing things to happen naturally the way they happen? You can't control saving every life. I hate to say that.
Yeah, right.
You can't heal every sick person.
Yeah.
There's just certain things you can't do, and you should stop trying. So how do we eventually get back into that message about, hey, we set these guidelines and that's it?
Perhaps what it will take is people seeing the bad consequences of letting government try to control everything. Let's talk about environmentalism for a minute. The whole environmental movement is designed to maximize the power of government. They're really not that concerned about a tenth of a degree of temperature over the long haul. What they're concerned about is what gives the government more power to control the way people run their lives.
What government?
Well,
the world government that they want to create?
Eventually, yes. Many of them say it should not be individual governments making these decisions. It should be world government. Now, what a frightful idea that is, that there would be bureaucrats sitting in the UN making rules for everyone that everyone must obey. And think about the enormous cost of paying for all the enforcers that they would have out meddling in people's lives. But perhaps people are starting to realize that this is a pathway that leads to ruin. It doesn't lead to prosperity and equality and cleanliness, but it does ruin your society.
Agreed. And as the UN has shown time and time and time and time again how useless they are.
Right.
So if that's the model you want to double down on.
Yeah. If you follow their logic, the logic of the progressives, well, we should have world government. We should have a world dictator who will be the right person who knows everything, and he'll have people around him who will scientifically manage. Or do you want to have freedom, where each person gets to run his own life, provided he lives within, it respects other people's rights to do the same thing? That's ultimately the choice. Big government, unified world government, or individual freedom.
I don't know if the choices are ever put that starkly. And maybe we should start doing that. Damn straight.
I think we should be. That the end result of all this progressive stuff is not just omnipotent government within the United States. And sometimes they even allow people to get a glimpse of their vision, that they really, really want world government. There are some of these big left-wing thinkers who want a total economic reset of the world, so it'll be controlled by people like themselves, stamping out all this individualism stuff, and everyone will be happy. In fact, this is a phrase that one of these left-wing reset people likes to use. In the future, I will own nothing and I will be happy. I don't think people would be happy that way. And I don't want to give them the power to find out.
You want to make that choice, you go right ahead.
Yeah, if people want
I'm not stopping you.
Want to give up their property and live in some kind of a communal, well, that's fine. You can do that individually. But don't force that on the rest of us. And that's the thing about government, force. It's not about saying, what would you like to do? What do you think works better? What are your preferences? No, it's about force.
Okay, so coming back into a forward-looking concept here. You're familiar with the concept about Web 3.0?
No, not really.
All right,
I'm
so-
not a tech. Very
Well, this is
restricted.
yeah. I'm not. Listen, I'm not certainly not the high grade technologist like a lot of other people that I know. But all of the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, non-fungible tokens, all of these decentralized administrative organizations, DAOs, where they're decentralized. All that technology is based on computer algorithms churning out blocks that are built in a digital ledger, right? And they allow for people anywhere at any time to do all kinds of things that they never had access to do before. One of which is avoid fiat money. Now, obviously, this is a very double-edged sword, and there's a massive debate on micro and macro levels about, and this was part of the reasoning how Bitcoin got started. Is it a true alternative or a 21st century gold standard, potentially? Actually, maybe it even goes beyond that, where now you have this uncontrolled or this store of value that is not controlled or related to any political or governmental parties.
Yes, yes.
So do people, the debate now gets to, do you trust the devil you know or the devil you've come to know, who are politicians and central bankers? Which there's no more independence between those parties. Let's just face facts. I don't care what
Yes,
nation you go
yes.
to, right? Or do you trust a disparate group of millions of independent individuals all over the globe who are doing things?
In other words, competition. F.A. Hayek wrote a paper in 1976 entitled Competition in Currency. Now, he never envisioned anything like Bitcoin and Ethereum, but his concept was let people compete to produce stores of value that consumers will want to use. That's the solution. Get away from fiat money and let people compete to produce. And I have no idea what'll win out in that. And maybe there'll be one winner, maybe there'll be many different winners. Ones that don't succeed, though, they'll fall by the wayside. And I think the one thing that will never succeed is just fiat money printed by government, produced by government, which has no intrinsic value. And government can say, you have to accept this. We make this legal tender. That's the thing we have to get away from, is fiat money dictated by government. Let competition rip. We'll find the best way of making trades.
And yes, and a big part of the argument is that if you've got this decentralized format, nobody can control it. Now, bad actors, though. Who do you go to when there's a problem? And that's part of the interesting debate here in this whole Web 3.0 universe.
Yeah.
Because if a bad actor hacks a block and steals some kind of digital currency, who do you go to for relief to prosecute that individual?
Yeah.
Because that individual may, be in Belarus.
Yeah. That is a problem, and there may not be an easy solution to that problem. There's never been a total solution to the problem of theft. Sadly.
No, agreed. But it's an interesting conundrum that we stare at now, and there are some people making very strong arguments that the digitalization allows for the ultimate freedom to really work, And now people don't even need to be attached to a national border anymore.
Right.
So it's like I don't want to say it's world government. It's like it's even a level beyond that thinking, where you have all these individuals contributing to some digital product, or getting access to a possible investment that they would have never had any chance at in the past. And it's a really, really fascinating world. And I even wonder if these technologies can't also embed some of the solutions that we seek.
Perhaps so. Yeah, and that's part of the entrepreneurial process is coming up with new products and then finding out ways of solving the problems that those new products you've created lead to. And people are innovative in many ways, and I think if there's going to be a solution to the problem of digital theft, it's going to be the people in the marketplace who have an incentive to
stop it.
To stop it, yes. They'll do better for themselves if they can show people my product is not susceptible or less susceptible to hacking than other people's products.
Yeah, and I'm really curious, and I'm actually working on a couple of projects right now that potentially are raising money in this Web3 arena. Business models. I'm just kind of dipping my toe in the water, so more to come on that. But I would envision actually, because a lot of those Web3 concepts coming back into some of the themes that we talked about here and that you touch on in the book. Like take education, for example. In my mind, education is like a Lego set, right? You build something with a lot of blocks that have different shapes, different sizes, right? Different colors, and you arrange them in ways that are useful for what you're trying to accomplish and what drives you.
Yeah.
You've seen some Lego sets that could fill this room, and then there's Lego sets that, maybe, that would just fit on top of the book, So it's like a lot of them business models around the Web 3.0 is content creators. Like our first blog episode here potentially eventually could be part of this could be my contribution to some decentralized administrative organization or DAO, DAO, and I get credits for that. I get these little digital coins for that eventually potentially build up in value, that I could trade for other things. I see education as a massive collection of content, right? You taught. You're a content provider. You wrote a book. You're a content provider. If you record music, like, you're going to, here's a little pitch for your new radio show that you're going to have with the classical music. You're a content provider during that period of time that you're on air, right?
Yes.
And there are people who consume that content. And you get credit for creating it, and they get credit for consuming it. So now all of a sudden, it's a whole different medium of exchange in a different way that, there's no middleman necessarily.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
These are all the functions of education, and I think education works best when it's not centrally directed. When we don't have people saying, this is what a school will be like, and this is what a school will teach, but instead when parents and individual learners of any age get to decide for themselves, well, what do I really need to know? What do I want to know? And who's going to provide the content that I want? Make it a market as opposed to a government system that said that, this is our system. No, that doesn't work very well. The system will turn out to work for the people who run the system. What we need is competition that students, parents, learners of any age can go into and say, yeah, here's what I need to know, and here's who provides that content the best way for me.
Man, that's really heavy. That's ironic.
That's the way America used to work.
No kidding. But here's the real rub. We're full of irony today, George.
Yeah.
The same people that decry systematic racism everywhere, won't fix the one system that actually is systemically racist.
Yes, that's a very good point.
How the hell does that happen?
Well, because that one system is under their control, and they love it that way.
Can you argue with the results?
The results are we have a lot of people who are very, very poorly educated, despite we've spent a tremendous amount of money on schooling them. Those are the results, and people are starting to realize that. COVID has helped. A lot of parents have seen, hey, my kids weren't learning a darn thing in those public schools that are now shut, but they're doing pretty darn well in learning pods that we've set up or homeschooling.
I guess the question then we return back to standards. How do you prove that one methodology was effective? How does it stick with that person? Now, you got to track this overall. Again, this gets back to the long journey that a lot of people don't want to work on. How do you create a system that actually looks kind of forward and backward and makes those adjustments?
Well, the word create, that's the problem, Bob. We don't create these things. We let them happen. They spontaneously come about. It's like capitalism. Anything in capitalism isn't created, isn't designed. It comes about spontaneously. Same thing with education. What will work in education, people will discover spontaneously. What works, people will go to that. What doesn't work, people will avoid it.
So our schools need to become laboratories.
They can become
more so than ever.
Yes. Have lots and lots of people trying lots of different things in education. Let 1,000 flowers bloom in education. People try Montessori schools and homeschooling and private schools. The one thing we don't want is a government system that will be run for the benefit not of the students and parents, but for the benefit of the teachers and the administrators.
So we got to unlock the money.
Yes.
Which gets into a very interesting debate about property taxes and schools and attachment of student to said fees and...
Right. We should no more have government community schools than we should have government community churches or government hamburger stands. Let people make their own choices.
So does the world need ditch diggers too, to quote Judge Smails?
Does it need what?
The world needs ditch diggers too.
The world needs everything.
Well, I guess it gets back to when do we accept, again, letting nature work the way it does, right?
Yes.
Allowing things to happen. People need to make these choices and these trade-offs in their own lives, right? And, some people like this, the college education concept, right? And you kind of get into some of it here. It's not worth it for everybody. But there's a lot of other things they could be doing to help society. They get a role.
Yes.
Everybody gets a role.
Yeah, people are pretty good at figuring out what trade-offs are to their benefit and what trade-offs aren't, if they're free to do so, and if they bear the costs. Now, unfortunately, government steps in and says, well, we think everyone should go to college and we're going to make it free or we're going to subsidize it. That's been a tremendous waste.
Yes, and again, back to competition, colleges should be competing for the students they take in and the students they put out, right?
I agree.
Garbage in, garbage out.
One of the worst decisions in American history was the decision to get the federal government into student aid. Up until that time, relatively few people thought college was worth it. College didn't cost that much money. Standards were pretty high. And then the government decided to be compassionate and generous. And so under LBJ, we started federal student aid programs.
Those are the Pell Grants?
Pell Grants and student loans. Well, that just grew like Topsy. And now everyone thinks, I got to get a college degree, no matter what it costs, and the government will provide the money. And the politicians say, well, don't worry about it because maybe we'll forgive your student loans. It's led to a prodigious waste of time and money. Lots and lots of people spending years taking courses that mean nothing to them, accumulating debts, and then the politicians say, well, It's not your fault, so we're going to declare a moratorium on debt payments, or we're going to relieve you of your obligations because we think you've paid enough.
How does that teach a valuable lesson?
It does. It teaches them to look to the state instead of looking to their own devices and saying, "Gee, if I screw up, I'm going to bear the cost of it."
But
it teaches irresponsibility.
Right, again, but back to contracts, honoring contracts. How do you not allow a contract to be honored? If you didn't like the contract, you shouldn't have signed it.
I agree.
You don't pay your mortgage, you get kicked out of your house.
Yes.
You don't pay your rent? Well,
yeah.
Usually, you have to leave the premises.
Well, of course, the government also decided during COVID that you shouldn't have to pay your rent.
Well, in some cities like New York, that's normal.
Yes.
Tenant-landlord court has nothing to do with landlords, trust me.
The difference between the taker mentality and the maker mentality. The takers say, well, we're going to protect you and we're going to make everything fine and easy for you. And the makers say, if I goof up, I'm going to bear the cost, and so I better be darn careful what I decide to do. That really is the theme of the book, is how can we avoid the takers obtaining total control of the United States? Is it too late for us to fight them off? And I think we have a fighting chance at this point.
You know, you bring up an interesting thought for me. Could you potentially be couching the argument and using this terminology in categories, stark categories? You know, could you be offering the solution here? I think so. But you're giving ammunition to the folks who want to get into elected roles, saying, here's the side I'm on.
Reading between the lines, obviously you've done that, Bob. That's what I had in mind. I wanted to give a lot of good ammunition to people who are getting it, that the United States is in deep trouble. We're in a boat heading toward the cataract, and we're about to go over the waterfall, unless we can turn around. And what I try to do with the book is give people who are at all receptive to the idea that we're in deep trouble as many arguments as I possibly could about the damage government is doing to us, that we could avoid if we hadn't made these decisions long ago, and it better turn around right now before it's too darn late.
So in a lot of ways, you really taking a couple of steps ahead. You're really advocating for returning our governance to as local a possibility.
Yes, and as little government as possible, as much individual freedom as possible.
But like politics, all politics is local, right?
Yeah,
and that couldn't be a good thing.
It could be a good thing, but local politicians can be very tyrannical as well. The best thing is leave politics to the very, very few things government needs to do, protecting life, liberty, and property, and otherwise let competition rip, let freedom work.
So I wonder if, in fact, there's a do we have a call to return to freedom? Are there enough people who even kind of understand what that means? Do we have enough people left? And I've heard some arguments that actually, I guess you'd call them, I guess they'd be Generation Z, which are the kids that are kind of in high school now. Mm-hmm. Would you consider them Generation Z? Or what are they considered? That we're actually relying on some of these kids to actually have a clue about how to help later on.
Yeah.
Have you had any conversations with folks in that demographic?
No.
Or
don't know anyone in that demographic at all.
Well, it would seem to me that they should probably start by reading this
that's
in their summer reading list in school.
Yes, I would like young people, especially, to read Awakening of Jennifer Van Arsdale. If we have a future, I think it's going to be those people saying, I don't want that. I don't want the takers and then what they'll do to the United States. I'd rather have the freedom to live my own life and succeed or fail on my own.
You know, I guess how do you provide people the comfort level of being able to take that on? I mean, because, you know, as a young person, that's a pretty daunting thought. You know, gee, I'm in control the rest of my life. Ooh, you know, I know. I live, you know, with my girlfriend and her teenage son, and you know, he's a good kid, good student, great athlete. He's the whole package, right? But just like life issues, you know, dude, make your own appointment to get your hair cut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, go take your car into the shop. If you know it needs brakes or you know it needs it, handle it.
Yeah.
Oh, I need this. Yeah, these things called drugstores, Walgreens, a massive chain. They're everywhere.
Responsibility.
Right.
Individual
responsibility. And just, I mean, you know, I'm that Gen Xer. So, you know, I was the latchkey kid, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, Gen Xers don't need anybody to do anything for. We were self-sufficient in a big way. And I got to tell you, not to turn this into a generational argument, I always like to think that I turned out all right. You know, there's a lot. I mean, I was, you know, how do we instill some of those values into, you know, and this has actually become a, you know, one of my own personal goals is to instill some of these values in Brady, which is the kid I was just describing. You know, it's like, how can I teach him to think? And I was literally having this conversation yesterday. How do I teach him to think backwards? How screwed am I if I forget this, lose that, this gets damaged, my friend doesn't show up on time, or I don't show up on time? What gets screwed up, and how bad is it? That's how I view the world. That's how I was taught to view the world.
That's how folks of our generation view the world. And that's what the takers in their control of educational institutions and governments have undermined, is the idea that, gee, things are going to be really bad for me if I screw up. Think about the way so many teachers now say, oh, you didn't show up for the test. Oh, well, that's too bad. I'll let you make it up. Or, oh, you blew this. Oh, I'm sorry, but you know, we'll give you extra credit if you do an extra credit project. Instead of holding people to rigorous standards and letting them suffer the consequences, this whole mindset is, well, we'll take care of you. Well, the trouble is, if everyone takes care of you, you never grow up, never become responsible.
Right. There's never any penalty.
Yes, penalties. We need to start reinstituting penalties.
Yeah, I mean, look.
You get an F if you don't learn the material.
And if you get too many Fs,
then you're out.
You're out.
Yes.
Or you get left back.
And stop wasting your time and our money on schooling. If you're not going to do anything, well, then you're off on your own.
Here's a shovel.
Sink or swim.
Or a hammer.
Yes.
Which is perfectly fine.
And lots of people who failed in the old days realized they failed, and they, with that shovel in hand, made something darn good of themselves when they had to.
Right. Well, there was that, but then there was also the perennial losers that just never went anywhere, and they, you know, got an addiction or a problem or whatever. But there was a stigma, associated with being that guy. You know, and it occurs to me a lot. How do we teach people to avoid being that guy?
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to sound sexist or whatever, or that girl, that person who is stuck. Why don't you do everything in your power just to avoid that problem? Yeah. And if everybody did that.
Yeah. That's another generational thing. A lot of parents these days go to the nth degree to make sure that Susie and Johnny never suffer any ill consequences. Helicopter parents in schools, for instance, they'll come flying in full of anger if the teacher gives the kid a bad grade and try to browbeat the teacher into inflating the grade, and it oftentimes works.
I don't know. I went to Catholic high school, and it was pretty simple. Here's the deal, and if you didn't like it, there's a door.
Yeah.
And I caught a few beatings in my time too. So, but that's a total thing of the past. Actual discipline in school is listen. It was simple. You stepped out of line, you got put back in.
Right. Yeah. That's another part of the degradation of American education, is that we can't discipline students any longer. And now we even have educational experts saying that when we do discipline, it has to be proportional to race. We can't have more punishments meted out for any one race than for any other race. It's got to be fair. That's a recipe for
I saw that debate. I saw that
destroyed.
that come up recently. That is one of the most asinine things that I had ever.
It's an obsession with equality that is contrary to the way the world works.
George, listen, if it's the same crime, it deserves the same punishment, regardless of who committed what.
Yeah, right.
Right? Fair enough.
Right.
If that's what you're seeking out, great. I got your point. We can build that in. But if you see the same person committing the same problem, they obviously didn't get the message.
Right.
I grew up in one of those households where my parents were the first ones to say, if the principal called the house or the principal came by, the teacher came by,
yes,
what did he do?
Yes.
It wasn't what did you do?
Mm-hmm.
It was what did he do? And then I got it later on, twice as bad, So I had a penalty at school plus that. It is what it is, you learn from it.
Yes.
You don't do it again, right?
Right, and that the level of discipline has sadly fallen away over the years.
And that's how we get Pat Farnsworths of the world.
15-minute warning.
Gotcha. Oh, I thought there was like a little clicker, little alarm for that.
Just me.
Fair enough. Right? I mean, that's how we churn out Pat Farnsworth.
Exactly.
And then they become president of the United States, leader of the free world.
Yes.
So to speak.
And then they take their terrible ideology of equality and inflict it upon everyone else.
Yeah, George, it irks me in a lot of ways, and it gets me. It really makes my blood boil, and I like to stay calm in my old age, and not overreact the way I used to as a pissed off youth. But it really angers me that we're in this position where we have to really choose. Our choices are poor. How could it be? For a lot of the things we do, millions of choices, too many choices in a lot of ways. Like, as a consumer, right? You have millions of choices of toilet paper or toothpaste or this. But yet, it's we have these poor choices of quote unquote leaders, and it's like I really hope that your book spurns some rethinking.
That's why I wrote it. That's exactly why I wrote it. I was worried about the future of the country. My belief is that freedom works, competition works, individual rights need to be protected, and all of that, the bedrock of America, it's just being flushed away by politicians like Pat Farnsworth and Joe Biden.
Yeah, and back to your comment earlier about the two-party system. I hate that we have to rely on the Republicans. That's just how it is right now. With a possible third party getting created is, there's been talk about that for as long as I can remember.
Yeah. That just divides the makers in two. The takers always have their one party.
Agreed.
And that just makes it easier for them
to win.
What we need to do is, I think, forget about third parties. We need to have a party that stands for the traditional American principles, private property, individual responsibility, limited government, and make the case that that's what will make for the greatest prosperity and harmony. We can see the disharmony that comes from the divide, the divisiveness that the takers insist on, the CRT stuff, critical race theory. They teach young kids that some races are oppressed and other races are oppressors. This is just divisive stuff that accomplishes no good in the long run. It turns people against each other. Instills people with a sense of grievance instead of the feeling I can succeed on my own. Oh, I'm an oppressed minority. I can't succeed unless the government does something for me. That's the message that we're sending out to millions of young people, and it's got to stop.
It does have to stop, and I'm really hoping that your book creates an awakening, amongst the folks that really need it, because I don't know how we survive otherwise. And, can we get to the point where those basic concepts, foundational concepts, can be used in a constructive way? You can have a lot of debates about how to potentially achieve some of these things because there would be different ways. There could be different means and methods, and I think that's a very healthy thing to do. And that's what we used to do.
Yes.
I mean, congressional sessions were
real debates.
Yes. And then, you know what, sometimes some fisticuffs.
Right. And now they're just stacked for PR.
Maybe we have to stop televising. Maybe we should get rid of C-SPAN first.
Yeah, well, what I think we need to do is get the government out of doing most of the things it's doing. They shouldn't be having hearings because they shouldn't even be thinking about what they're going to do.
So let's hope that whoever runs for the Republican ticket next runs on, here's all the departments I'm going to close in the executive branch.
Well, that's one of my ideas in the book. I'd like for voters to start insisting, the candidates tell them, how are we going to downsize government? How are we going to make it less costly for us? What departments do you propose to shut down? And don't accept blathery answers. Say, look, I want concrete.
Detailed plan.
I want a detailed plan.
Like the contract with America.
Yes. Better than that even.
More detailed.
Insist on details. And maybe then politicians start to, hey, people actually care about economy. They care about not wasting our scarce resources. They're worried that the country is going to go bankrupt if the government continues the way it is. Until now, those voices have seldom ever been heard. So I think it'd just be great if, during the upcoming elections, some candidates were startled to hear some guy at a town hall stand up and say, I'd like to see your plan for shrinking government. What are you going to do to cut down the cost of government for me and my family?
Oh, maybe then the Federal Election Commission could say you have to have a debate. If you refuse a debate, you lose.
A real debate would be nice. We don't have anything that even comes close to true debates in politics.
I agree. No, that I think is another foundational. I would call that a foundational principle too. I would argue strongly. Even before our documents, they were being drafted, what did they have? Hamilton spoke impromptu for 6 hours
Yes.
at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. Off the top of his head.
Yes.
No notes. No preparation. Who could do that now?
Very few people. They didn't have teleprompters back then.
They had,
and these days, that's all they rely upon.
Absolutely.
A crutch.
So to everybody out there, The Awakening of Jennifer Van Arsdale by George Leef, and that's L-E-E-F, not L-E-A-F.
Correct.
And it's an easy read.
It's fun.
It's fun. You'll learn stuff. You'll probably be reminded of things that you'd be like, oh, that's what they mean by that.
And you might even get a little bit angry.
Well, as I indicated to you, I was not even 3 or 4 chapters in, and I wanted to break windows. It really got me. As a matter of fact, I'll tell you, it got me more angry than watching an episode of Sean Hannity.
Good.
So, with that said, George, you have anything else to add? We're approaching our end of time here.
Well, it's been good talking with you, Bob, and I hope that listeners out there are going to check out my book.
Where can they find it?
You can get it it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get it in Kindle if you want. It's published by Post Hill Press, but I don't think they like to directly sell. Your choices are go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble at this point.
Okay. All right, wonderful. All right, everyone. That was our first maiden voyage of the What's Your Problem podcast with Bob Koncelik. And we don't know when the next one's going to be, but hopefully it'll be as entertaining or better than this one.
It was a great pleasure, Bob.
Thanks, George.